The third passage in the Koran that is outside of the first 5 chapters, but is also worth mentioning, is verses 75 and 80 of the 18th chapter, called the Cave, which tell the story of Moses and an unnamed traveling companion, and begins in verse 75, which says, "They journeyed on until they fell in with a certain youth. Moses' companion slew him, and Moses said, 'You have killed an innocent man who has done no harm. Surely you have committed a wicked crime.'" And then ends in verse 80, which says, "As for the youth, his parents are both true believers, and we feared lest he should plague them with his wickedness and unbelief. It was our wish that the Lord should grant them another one in his place, a son more righteous and more filial." It is interesting to note that in this passage in the Quran, even the bloody tyrant Moses is shocked by this Muslim's murder of an innocent person. Muslims use this passage to justify their practice of so-called honor killing, whereby Muslims murder their own relatives, in practice often torturing them to death, especially daughters who have married or who want to marry outside their parents' wishes, in order to preserve what those murderers believe to be their family honor within the larger context of the Islamic religion. However Muslims could possibly associate the concept of honor with the practice of sadistically murdering loved ones is completely beyond me, because everyone who truly knows God knows that God, as spirit, is love. So to betray one's own family just to satisfy the requirements of a false morality, that is, a morality that is anti-love, anti-life, anti-health, and politically motivated, is the epitome of dishonor. This same Islamic false sense of family honor was on display when Omar bin Laden, son of infamous Islamic terrorist Osama bin Laden, complained that his father's burial at sea dishonored his family, when in fact what really dishonored Omar's family was his father's murder of 3,000 innocent and unarmed people in the World Trade Center. People who, unlike Osama bin Laden himself, actually worked for a living. In the eyes of the true God of love, only behavior that is loving is truly worthy of honor. No human being who has ever truly loved another human being from his or her heart could possibly honor such a loveless religion as Islam, or such a loveless book as Islam's foundational text, the Koran. I would also like to mention that in Islam's secondary foundational text, which is called the Haddiths, which are sayings attributed to Muhammad, we find a passage, though I am not sure at which verse number or from which translation, that says, "The last hour would not come unless the Muslims will fight against the Jews, and the Muslims would kill them, until the Jews would hide themselves behind a stone or a tree, and a stone or a tree would say, 'Muslim, or the servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" What this passage is describing is clearly not self-defense, and this passage tells Muslims that the world cannot end, hence that they cannot attain their ultimate reward until they have had an all-out apocalyptical war with all the Jews. One poll I read showed that 73% of Palestinians agree with this hadith. So let's sum up all of what we read today in the Quran. In the first 5 chapters of the Quran, we read that Muslims should kill all innocent or unarmed people who will not convert to Islam, wherever they may be found throughout the entire world, or at the very least, just be unfriendly to them. Although in my reading of the Quran, it was never really made clear to me when to apply which of those two very different responses. That we infidels, or at least those of us who can be construed as being pagan idolaters, are friends of Satan. That the God of Islam himself describes himself as being truculent. That Muslims should kill all apostates within their own religion, wherever they may be found throughout the entire world. That Muslims should emigrate in large numbers to foreign lands in order to take them over. That women are inferior to men, and therefore men should beat them. That Muslims should mutilate thieves, who then will never be able to work themselves out of their poverty. that Muslims should not be permitted to convert to, nor even just to hear about, other religions, and that Allah has laid a curse on all Jews and on all Christians that transforms them into apes or pigs. As if all this by itself were not enough to lead us at least to question the validity of the Koran, we further read, in sporadic chapters beyond the first 5 chapters, and in the Haddiths, that it is Allah Himself who will spread terror into the hearts of non-Muslims, but that Muslims also must do their part to assist Allah in spreading that terror, and that one of the means that Muslims should employ in order to spread that terror is to cut off people's heads, that Islam should conquer all of the religious political world, that it is okay to murder people in order to preserve a false sense of family honor, that Muslims should pull Jews out of hiding in order to kill them, and that Muslims must end the world with an all-out apocalyptical war with all the Jews. Some of the Koranic passages we examine today may have had a little wiggle room for interpretation, but I dare say that our interpretation of those passages is validated by the whole bloody world history of Islam. From Muhammad's slaughter of innocent and probably sometimes also unarmed polytheistic pagans in and around Medina through 624 and 625, to the bloody and at best internecine, while at worst fratricidal, warfare among factions of Muslims fighting over a successor to Muhammad after his death in 632, to the slaughter, intimidation, deprivation, forced conversion, or expulsion of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent and often unarmed non-Muslims during the militaristic expansion of the Islamic Empire, leading up to the founding of the Islamic Ottoman Empire in 1299, which at its broadest will reach 695,000 square miles in size. To the destruction of Constantinople, then capital of the Byzantine Empire, by Islamic Ottoman military forces, using what was then the world's largest ever cannon, in 1453, and the subsequent conversion of its beautiful Hagia Sophia Basilica, then seat of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, into a mosque, which is an event still bemoaned to this day by Greek Orthodox parishioners whom I myself have met. To the attempted genocide of Armenian, Grecian, and Assyrian Christians, and the successful demolition of their Christian monuments by Turkish Muslims of the Ottoman Empire between 1914 and 1922, and up to this very day, with the sometimes unacknowledged, yet very real, attempted genocide of both Chaldean Christians and Yazidi in Iraq and Syria by all kinds of Islamic factions, including some factions that are fairly close to what we in the West would consider to be mainstream Islam. Now, again, to be fair, not everything I read in the Quran was bad. I also read about charity for the poor, although the sincerity for that charity is highly questionable, because a verse, number 73, once again of the 8th chapter called the Spoils, indicates that Muslim charity is not motivated by heartfelt compassion. Rather, Muslim charity is motivated by political cunning, because that verse says, "The unbelievers give aid to one another. If you do not do the same, there will be persecution in the land and great corruption." But still, in spite of the less than meritorious motive for Islamic charity betrayed by this passage in the Quran, Islamic charity is at least some kind of charity. And I also read about inheritance for females, and sometimes, though seemingly contradictory, even a kind of protective stance toward the people of the book, meaning Jews or Christians. But the sum weight of the good passages that I read in the Quran was greatly outweighed by the sum weight of the bad passages that I read in the Quran, the kind that you and I have been examining together in my presentation to you here today. What I am saying right now is not hate speech toward Muslims. I am only pointing out how their own foundational text, the Quran, teaches them to hate others. The haters are those who try to justify the Quran, which indisputably and unequivocally teaches its followers to murder, hurt, terrorize, and conquer innocent and unarmed people throughout the entire world, For in so doing, those would-be justifiers of the Koran show that they hate, or at least do not care about, the very real victims of those violent Koranic teachings. All this popular media talk about Islamophobia is so ridiculous, because Islam's evil intentions are stated right there in the Koran in black and white, including all of the horrific passages that you and I have been examining here today. Any person who wants to determine for him or herself whether there is horror in the Koran or not need read only the first 5 chapters to decide, and any person who condemns other persons for criticizing the Koran without having read at least those first 5 chapters for him or herself is both morally and intellectually insincere. It is also ridiculous to label the people who denounce Islam or its foundational text, the Koran, as racist, because Islam is not a race. Rather, Islam is a religion, and a religion that encompasses many different races at that, whether it be the black African races of Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, or the sub-Saharan Islamic villages, or the white European races of Bosnia, Albania, or Chechnya, or the brown Arabian, Persian, Turkish, Malaysian, etc. races in other parts of the world. And it is also ridiculous to label the Muslims who carry out these horrific Koranic edicts as radical, because the Koran is the foundation of all Islam. So whoever does not follow the teachings of the Koran, and by this we mean all of those teachings, is by definition not a Muslim. Because I have this knowledge, I do not understand how our mealy-mouthed Western world leaders can say that our war is not against Islam. Because our war, at least on the level of intellect, culture, or values, should be against Islam, or at least against its foundational text, the Koran, because of all of these horrific passages that we find within the Koran.